Welcome to the next video in the 3 voice counterpoint videos. There's going to be a lot of things in this video. Think of it like a 2-part video. First, we're going to go over 2nd, 3rd, and 5th species counterpoint exercises in 3 voices. We're going to go through the walkthrough of each one, filling in the notes. Doing so, we will be analyzing it as we're filling it in. And stick around till the second part of the video, because that's basically going to be a ×4 lesson, where we're not only going to have useful tips in 3 voice counterpoint, but then also some useful tips when we want to transfer what we're writing into different instruments. Okay, starting off with the species examples and a walkthrough of each one, starting here with 2nd species. These species examples come from the BachtotheBasics YouTube channel and his videos on 3 voice counterpoint for 2nd and 3rd species, as well as Florid counterpoint for the 3 voices. Florid counterpoint is also known as 5th species. So when I'm saying 5th species or Florid counterpoint, those are the same thing. We see in our first example a cantus firmus in the bass. Let's listen to it and then fill it in. This first example is going to start off by adding the 2nd voice that will create the 1-to-1 ratio with the cantus firmus. As we can see, the top voice is the voice that was chosen to create the 1-to-1 ratio with the bass line. After this, we're going to add the 2nd species line in the middle. Of course, you can choose which line is going to have the 2nd species line, as well as which line is going to have the 1-to-1 ratio with the cantus firmus. This is just the option that we chose here. And also filling in the voice with the 1-to-1 ratio first, and then filling in the 2nd species line after that, is not a rule, but it is a method of completing this. You can compose both of the lines at the same time if you want, but using this method can work well because building the 1-to-1 structure adds the notes you want to create the proper chord or harmony that you're looking for. So there you're just plotting down the harmonic idea measure to measure. Doing this allows you to adjust any of these notes if you need to when adding the 2nd species line. And you probably will end up adjusting some things. But at the same time, it is good to try out different methods, possibly finding one that works the best for you, or just finding out different perspectives of realizing the counterpoint. Different cantus firmus, especially placed in different voices, can cause the composer to adjust their method accordingly. When you analyze a cantus, always be on the lookout for a leap of a third. This can be a perfect opportunity to create a voice exchange. As you can see in measure 3 to 4, the bass voice leaps up a third from A to C. Then above this in measure 3 to 4 again, you can see the soprano line leaps down a third from C to A. So you can see those notes exchanging. As A goes to C, C goes to A. This is what's known as a voice exchange. The same thing happens in measure 5 and 6, where the bass voice leaps down a third of D to B, and the soprano line leaps up a third of, you guessed it, B to D. Of course, you can see that, but now you get the idea of a voice exchange. One note goes up a third, the other voice goes down a third, or vice versa. Not only does it sound nice, but we can see the contrary motion made from doing this. After adding these voice exchanges, the rest of the line became very easy to fill in. Okay, now we're going to have a listen to these 2 voices, and then we're going to fill in the 2nd species line. Okay, so now we have an idea with what we're dealing with so far, and you had a chance to hear those voice exchanges. Not only are thirds helpful for that, but thirds are also helpful when you want to prolong a harmony. In measure 3 to 4, A to C can imply an A minor chord, while in measure 5 to 6, D to B can imply a first inversion B minor chord. This is important because this will allow for a moment of accented dissonance if we're going to treat this as a prolonged harmony. As I went over in a previous video, accented dissonances are found when harmony is prolonged. Because of this, we can make a goal to have a dissonance over each of these prolongations of harmony when composing our second species line. This is the chosen response that allows for the accented dissonances over each of these prolonged harmonies. For measure 3 to 4 in the middle line, we can see that D is acting like an accented neighboring tone in the middle of the two notes E surrounding it. So you can see previously when we had two voices and we wanted to prolong the harmony, the accented dissonance was created from a chord tone of the harmony. But in this case, since we have three different voices, and we also did the voice exchange, now we have a C minor chord being implied through measures 3 and 4 with the bass voice and the top voice. While now the middle voice is able to have a neighboring tone that is not a chord tone of the chord at the time, a minor chord. Then we see measures 5 to 6, the stepwise motion, which in turn creates an accented dissonant passing tone on the downbeat or the strong beat of measure 6. Since measures 5 and 6 have that voice exchange of D and B, then we could have an implication of a B minor chord, or we might think B diminished if we're thinking about A minor, but here we can see F sharp and G sharp in measure 5, showing that we used a melodic minor, and because of that the F sharp would actually turn the B chord into a B minor chord. With the notes B, D, and F sharp, you can see that minor chord there. Furthermore, in measure 6, we see the accented passing tone of A. Now, if we think of a B minor chord and we think of the note A, we could see this could function as the seventh of a B minor chord, turning this into a B minor 7 chord. So this passing tone is a really good choice because not only is an accented dissonant passing tone, but is also turning measures 5 to 6 into a minor 7th chord once it gets to that accented passing tone on measure 6. Creating a 7th chord by using a dissonant passing tone or a dissonant device used in Counterpoint can be a really good way of including that 7th chord. And of course here we're not actually working with 7th chord harmony quite yet. So at this point we're creating 7th chord harmony within our response, but we're not necessarily building 7th chords here in 3 voices. Take a note that the dissonances on the strong beats are still treated how they normally would be, with the proper preparation and resolution. The dissonances are not being leapt to or anything else you would normally not do to a dissonance in Counterpoint. So remember, just because you're prolonging a harmony and you have that accented dissonance doesn't mean you can just place it in there wherever you want or however you want. You still have to treat it like a dissonance. It's just occurring there on that strong beat. And dissonances on the strong beat really catch the ear. They can really change the nature of a piece. Here are 3 reasons why choosing to add dissonances is helpful. Number 1, dissonances on the strong beats are not as usual as consonances on the strong beat. This alone can cause it to stick out harmonically, which can add to the interest. Number 2, they can help with creating stepwise motion, which was used to create a large stepwise ascent up to B in measure 6 from D in measure 4. And 3, now that we have a stepwise line, which is ascending here in a minor mode, allows us to take advantage of this and use a raised 6th and 7th degree known as the harmonic minor. As you can see, the melodic minor's raised 6th degree was actually used to create the harmonic implication on the downbeat, while the G sharp can be looked at as a passing tone, but could also be an implication that the chord is changing from that E minor chord there in measure 5 on the downbeat to a G diminished chord there on that upbeat for a moment. And we could look at that as occurring within the overall harmony of that B minor chord. Or you could just simply look at it as a passing tone and not think of it harmonically like that. And also to add to that, you can see that the melodic minor was chosen since the notes were ascending, which is the conventional way to use a melodic minor. On top of that, we already noted that this is a stepwise ascent in the middle voice all the way from measure 4 all the way to the end of measure 6. So doing so, this is a perfect time to use the melodic minor and then using it harmonically works perfectly because the line that is creating the harmony using the melodic minor is still going through the melodic minor in steps ascending. So this is the time that you would use the melodic minor harmonically. Learning how to use the harmonic and melodic minor at the proper times is a great skill to have, and it will allow you to have more freedom when you're composing. For some personal study, Bach's G minor invention can be a great score read for anyone trying to see how one of the greatest composers of counterpoint uses each of the different versions of minor. Okay, now we have the rest of the second species line filled in. Pay attention to how this realization responds to the already filled in measures 3 through 6. On the downbeat of measure 3, we must figure out how to get to C. In this circumstance, I'm going to go by the rule of not having more than one incomplete chord in a row. Because of this, the first inversion chord in measure 2 had to be completed on the downbeat, since in measure 1 we have an incomplete A chord with an octave above the bass and a fifth above that. So it's an incomplete chord without the third. Something that is told to also be avoided: when you do make an incomplete chord, you should strive to at least include the third if you can. If maybe there's some other reason why you're not going to include this and it helps with your overall end product, then of course there's good reasons why you wouldn't include your third. It's just saying strive to do that. So here in measure 2, without changing the top line, this leaves no other option but E. Once E was added to measure 2, the D passing tone basically wrote itself. Okay, and then jumping to the end of measure 6, where after that is the new material. And then near the end, where the other part wasn't completed, in measure 6, the second note B leaps down a fifth to E, creating a lingering dissonance. As the note B lingers in our memory from just hearing it, the chord changes to an incomplete chord of 2 E's an octave apart above the C in the bass. The B acts as a seventh in a C minor 7 chord. This brings us to the penultimate measure, which includes a suspended note of the tonic resolving to a raised leading tone, which steps back up to the tonic for the cadence, creating a 7/6 suspension. When you have scale degree 2 in the bass in the penultimate bar, a 7/6 suspension will work 9 out of 10 times. Now let's listen to the completed response. Okay, there we have the second species response in 3 voices. As you probably noticed, the accented dissonances stuck out a lot, but being treated properly and being within a prolonged harmony, they worked perfectly fine. And in my opinion, I think it adds a lot more drama, not only to the moments where the accented dissonances occur on the downbeats, but then after that on each downbeat, you're almost thrown off not knowing what to expect. Is it going to be a consonance or dissonance now? Okay, now we can see a third species response. We can also see that the cantus firmus is now in the top voice. So now let's give it a listen and then fill it in. For this response, we're going to choose to do the 1-to-1 ratio in the middle voice, and we're going to choose to do the third species line in the bass line. If the cantus firmus is not already in the bass, I typically choose to start my response with the bass line. This gives the proper foundation to fill in the other voice or voices. So because of this, first, we're going to be filling in the bass line, which we are choosing to do as the third species line. So how can we come up with a method to where we're still going to jot down the idea of the harmony or chords that we want in each measure without getting too complicated and trying to work with that third species voice starting in the bottom? As I talked about earlier, third species is an isolation of only using a 4-to-1 ratio. So against whole notes with 4 beats, we're going to be using quarter notes. We're not going to be using any other notes here in third species. Of course, we could also have something like a dotted half note, to where then we'd be composing 3 quarter notes to that. So here's a good strategy that could work for jotting down the idea of each chord or harmony that you want in each measure. And in this case, we're going to be actually using this as the blueprint. So each note that you see is going to stay, it's not going to be adjusted, and we're going to work with it because it is creating the implied harmony that we want to work with in each measure. As you see in measures 7 and 9, there are 2 notes. And no, this is not a marker for the upper note, but it is instead saying which one of these do I want to choose. In measure 7, you can see the note A on the bottom of the bass staff and also on the top of the bass staff. So it's not really clear yet which would be a better option, and once we get there, we will figure it out. And then in measure 9, you see also in the bass staff a B and then a G above that. So same thing, once we get to that area, we're going to figure out which one is going to work better. Doing this, we're creating an idea of where the melody wants to go and from where. Then from there, you can just fill in the gaps accordingly, striving for stepwise motion, but also some interest, such as nice leaps as well. It is good to note that the bass line can include more leaps than other voices to help with the harmony. But in this case, since the soprano line is just using whole notes and the bass line is a third species line, it's going to have a lot more motion. So we should strive to have more stepwise motion in the bass line because of this. By this I mean more stepwise motion than usual, not more stepwise motion compared to the upper line. That might be true, but that's irrelevant. The fact is, this line's going to be a lot more noticeable using a lot shorter note durations, so you don't want it jumping all over the place, being hard to follow. Of course, because we're doing counterpoint here, now with 3 voices, the whole point is to try to make each of the lines able to be followed and heard independently. The middle line or lines are typically fine being rather boring, sometimes even repeating notes a lot more frequently than other voices. This is especially true when you get to 4 voices, but at the same time, just like the bass line, if the middle line is traveling faster than the other voices, then it's going to stick out more. In that case, the middle voice should have more stepwise motion and not just stay in one place because it's going to be drawing more attention. So far, this response begins with a leap from G down to E, which can allow the D from the cantus to act as a lingering dissonance. While D is still fresh in your ears, the next chord has the notes E and G, where D will be functioning as what could be called a phantom dissonance. From E, the downbeats make their way through F to G. In measure 5, we can see a high point in the cantus with the note A. Pay attention to how the subdominant is placed in the bass at this moment. High points that harmonize with the subdominant are a good choice and always sound nice. Other than this, the tonic and dominant scale degrees are also really good choices as the bass line for a high point in the upper line. And again, in measure 7, we see those 2 A's. The reason why 2 A's were chosen is because I know that I still want the note A. This is because it's going to act as a deceptive cadence from measure 6 to measure 7. We're going to have the 5 chord to the 6 chord, while simultaneously allowing G to act as a lingering dissonance. In measure 6, we can see G with G above it. Then measure 7 has an A and E, where G acts as, again, a phantom dissonance of a 7th. The ending uses a 2-5-1 chord progression, which is very common. But right now, at this moment, it's still not clear if B or G should be chosen on the downbeat of the penultimate bar. Also, the beginning 2 bars are still not filled in, and it might be better to hold off on that for now. Okay, so now that we have the idea for each measure on the downbeats in the bass line where we're choosing to do the third species, let's fill in the gaps now between each of these notes, so then we know what note is going to work above this in the middle voice. Before we connect the gaps, let's take note that we do not want to have more than 1 incomplete chord in a row, and of course we need the properly treated dissonances. Okay, now we see everything is filled in. This starts with an upper neighboring tone, which creates an opportunity for a stepwise descent from the neighboring tone of A down to E. Since the downbeats of measure 4, 5, and 6 are traveling in steps, it can be very difficult to keep everything conjunct when you have 4 notes in each measure. We've learned many tricks by now, so this should be a piece of cake. One simple and standard method could be leaping down a third and then ascending up in steps, but we cannot keep this melodic device because creating motivity in counterpoint exercises is unwanted and could be looked at as a mistake. It is your choice if you want to be completely strict and say that you can only use the same melodic response once per exercise, or maybe you just want to be careful and not use it frequently or in close proximity to where it occurred before. The latter is a lot more realistic, as if you repeat a melodic device throughout a melody in a random moment, there's a good chance the listener is not going to notice it at all, and you're going to allow yourself to be in less strict confines. Furthermore, you can also be on the lookout for not repeating the same pattern of how a chord goes to another chord when the cantus or other parts are doing the same thing, creating familiarity, such as every time the cantus descends a step through 3 measures, the chords chosen are 4, 5, and 1. Or thinking about the melody, every time there's a leap of a fourth from one measure to another, the chords chosen are 5 to 1. Okay, but then if we actually did a consecutive duplication of a melody, that would be an error. This means if you have the same melody line in 2 measures back to back, whether that melody line shifts up or down, lines or spaces, this would be an error, and therefore in the next measure, measure 5, we must choose something else, and to not be boring, we should choose to do something else for measure 6 as well. Third species allows for some things that were not accessed yet in second species. One of those things are double neighboring tones, as well as double dissonant neighboring tones. Measure 5 chooses to use a double dissonant neighboring tone. Here F creates a third with A above it. F then steps up to G, creating a second with A. From here it leaps down a third to E, another dissonance, and then it goes back up a step to F, revealing that the bass line of measure 5 can be looked at as an embellishment of the note F. In measure 7, we can see that the lower A was chosen. This causes there to be more of a gap between the voices, which can serve as more dramatic as there is now a bigger difference in the registers. Measure 9, we can see B was chosen versus the G above it. This is simply due to the melodic line and where it seems to want to go. Using the upper G would have been fighting this. Now that these measures are completed, we can fill in the middle voice. In measure 3, B was chosen in order to make a complete chord by adding the third. We want to avoid incomplete chords that do not have a third. From B, it leaps up a fourth to E. This was the only option, nothing else would have worked. From E, it leaps down a third to C. D was also an option here, but there's a reason why C was chosen. C creates a root position chord versus D, which would have turned this into a first inversion chord with F in the bass and A in the soprano. We can see that this is the moment where the soprano line reaches its high point. Choosing a root position chord instead of a first inversion chord for this is a very conventional approach. Choosing this could be a preference, or instead could be looked at as nothing more than a choice of the 2 options. In measure 5, C goes to B in measure 6. This was the only option here. Other options would have resulted in parallel perfect intervals or an odd discombobulated line. We can see that 2 incomplete chords have already been chosen in measure 4 and measure 6. Here we are going with the rule that you cannot have more than 2 incomplete chords per exercise, not including the first and last measures. In this context, C, A, and G were the only options we could choose. After completing that, the first 2 measures were a lot more easy to write and to figure out what the lines were going to do. There was a goal to land on C on the downbeat of the second measure because this would allow an accent up to the next downbeat, G, using all steps. As you can see, that was accomplished here. The middle line leaps down from C to A, which then naturally wanted to go up to B. and A to B traveling in the same direction as the leap that is preceding it. This helps to prepare the leap. And also we can see the contrary motion as measure 3 descends down in steps to E in measure 4 at the same time that B is leaping up to E in the middle voice. Now that this 3-voice third species exercise is complete, let's give it a listen. It's good to note that this cantus firmus can be difficult to respond to, as it can cause a lot of problems when placed in either the top or middle voice. Doing things like marking the downbeats with the notes that you want help to create a foundational idea, which helps you know where you want to go to and from where. Rather than just writing measure by measure and seeing how each one is going to correspond and relate to another, it could be a good idea to instead look at the overall scope of what you are writing and come up with a good overall idea, goal, interesting moments, and try to make it happen with what you're working with. This relates to more than just writing for Counterpoint, but writing music in general. And of course, with more practice and experience, one will get better and better at the craft of seeing, hearing, or analyzing a cantus firmus and then coming up with a good idea based from that. Creating an idea or a foundation is not set in stone and serves more as a way to have a method of completing the response, avoiding writer's block, and also scoring efficiently. You can and probably will change your original idea to make it work with what you have, so look at it more as what you want to do rather than what you have to do. Now we're on to the 5th species or florid counterpoint section of this video. This example is going to show florid counterpoint with 3 voices, where 2 of the voices are florid. If you have not yet seen it, be sure to check out my florid counterpoint video for 2 voices, where all of the rules for florid counterpoint are discussed. And it's good to note that all of the previous counterpoint videos before that also lead up to that florid counterpoint video. Everything starting with 2 voices. Those same rules will also translate here in 3 voices in combination with all of the other rules we have learned throughout the series. But we do have to consider one new rule. In each measure, every beat must be properly marked at any given time, so the listener can follow along better. This means that here in a common time, also known as a 4/4 time, where we have 4 beats per measure, we must emphasize each one of these beats with a note in any one of the voice at all times. In measure 2 of the first example, we can see the cantus has a whole note, so that counts for beats 1, 2, 3, and 4. And of course, that's the case for every measure in the cantus in this example. Therefore, we can think of each of the whole notes as emphasizing beat 1, since that is the moment when it's changing from one note to another note. While the counterpoint in the bass line has 2 half notes emphasizing beats 1 and 3. And above that, the counterpoint in the middle voice has a dotted half note and a quarter note, which emphasize beats 1 and beat 4. Did you notice which of the beats was not emphasized in any of these? That was beat 2. No note starts on beat 2, but instead each of the voices has a note that is held through beat 2. This hinders the vitality of the rhythm and therefore is not a good choice. In these 3-voice florid counterpoint exercises in this video, we are going to consider this an error. So now we must have a note that emphasizes each beat while following all of the rhythmic guidelines talked about in the original florid counterpoint video for 2 voices. Usually, each rule in counterpoint also has another rule that allows it to be broken under certain circumstances, such as no dissonances on the strong beats, which is talked about earlier in the video in the 2nd species example. If you still don't understand that, there will be a link for a video explaining it called Dissonances on the Strong Beats in 2-to-1 Counterpoint. If we look at measure 2 of the 2nd example, we see that the cantus, of course, has a whole note, The bass line has a dotted half note with a quarter note, and the middle line has 2 half notes. So almost identical to what we had before, except the note durations of the bass and the middle voice are just flipped. But the thing to pay attention to is that in the second example, measure 2, the first half note in the middle voice is suspended from the measure before it. And this creates a dissonant suspension in this measure. This is very important because this is the only time that you will not have to emphasize beat 2. This is because the dissonant suspension has a strong enough tension on its own. Not just any suspension will do, this has to be a dissonant suspension for this to work. We can see that beat 4 is still emphasized with a quarter note in the bass line. Since there is no dissonant suspension occurring here, it must be emphasized to not be a rhythmic error. In the third example, measure 2, we can see it is perfectly fine because the beats can be emphasized in any voice, and we see that other than the whole notes in the cantus, the bass has a half note and 2 quarter notes, emphasizing beats 1, 3, and 4, but at the same time, the middle voice contains all quarter notes, therefore it emphasizes not only beat 2, but all of beats 1, 2, 3, and 4. But at the same time, making this perfectly fine and rhythmically coherent for the listener. Remember, we need this constant rhythmic emphasis at all times. And now for the actual response. Here we see a cantus firmus in the top voice. Let's first give it a listen, and then fill in the Florid counterpoint in both the voices. It is extremely common for the cantus to begin with first scale degree 1 and then scale degree 2. And as we can see here, this is the case for this cantus. Take note when this occurs in the upper voice, this allows for a 2-3 suspension in the bass. Notice that beat 2 is not emphasized with a quarter note in either of the voices where the dissonant suspension occurs. Because of the dissonant suspension, this is allowed. Do not forget to use suspensions in the bass. The 7-6 and 4-3 suspensions are very common in the upper lines, but the bass suspensions are also extremely helpful in situations just like they are in the other voices. Measure 3 had a goal to have E in the bass on the downbeat, so D was chosen as the note before to help to arrive there smoothly with a step. C sharp would have been a perfectly reasonable choice as well, not only harmonically and melodically, but also rhythmically, since measure 2 in the bass, the suspension allows for an emphasis on beat 2 to be abolished with no issues. With a half note, measure 2's bass line would emphasize beats 1 and 3. Then we can see the middle line has a dotted half note and then 2 eighth notes, where beat 1 is emphasized with the dotted half note, and beat 4 is emphasized with the eighth notes, since the eighth notes fill in the span of one beat. Since now both voices are florid, we must compromise in order to reach our goal within the guidelines. In measure 2, the middle line leaps up to the unison of the voice above it on beat 4. From there it travels down with passing tones, with a passing tone of D to C sharp. This shows an example of the concept unisons are not allowed on the strong beats, but they are allowed on the weak beats. It is always a good idea to think ahead when scoring counterpoint. With A in the cantus of measure 4, we could add F sharp in the bass, which then in return would allow us to create a 7th suspension in the middle voice. How would you fill in the gap of E to F sharp in measures 3 to 4? There are multiple answers, but take note that we will have to have an emphasis on beat 4 with either a quarter note or 2 eighth notes to fulfill the rhythmic guideline discussed in the beginning of this example. Here, the double neighboring tone is chosen to help complete this measure. E steps up to F sharp, which leaps down to D, where then D steps up to E to resolve. This creates a nice stepwise line that in return creates sixth intervals with the bass and middle voice on beats 1 and 2. Now in the middle voice, the passing tone in beat 2 of measure 3 is accompanied harmonically a sixth below it in the bass line, while the bass line at the same time is creating a dissonance of a dissonant neighboring tone. Generally, passing and neighboring tones sound good when they are supported in thirds or sixths. Passing and neighboring tones don't have to be on their own, and some might agree that they sound better when accompanied with another note. The dissonant seventh suspension in measure 3 must resolve down a step in measure 4. As you can see, this is what happened. But you can also see that the resolution of the suspension is interrupted. As we learned, we can do this for many reasons. One of those would be using a quarter note to create an embellishment of a chord tone, and then leaping up from there to the resolution tone. In this example, E leaps down to A. This leap helps create some more interest in the middle line since it has been so stepwise up to this point. To see the other suspension embellishments, that is also explained in depth in the original Florid Counterpoint video for 2 voices. Measure 4 in the bass line slows down in this moment. Coming from a faster moment of sixth quarter notes in a row from measure 2 to measure 3, this allows a shift of interest of the line that is moving quicker. From the first measure with the middle voice to the bass voice halfway through measure 2 to measure 3, then now back up to the middle voice for measure 4, leading to measure 5. If we look at the note chosen for each downbeat in the bass line, we can see that measure 1 and 2 have scale degree 1. Measure 3 has scale degree 2, and measure 4 has scale degree 3. With this in mind, the ascent continues now in measure 5 with scale degree 4. Once this was chosen, it showed that D major can act as the dominant of G major. In this example, and from now on, my counterpoint exercises will allow one chromatic alteration per exercise other than the different types of minor, where before this was not allowed. Using a chromatically altered note is going to cause it to have a tendency to resolve back to a note that's in the key, typically one that's a step away. We're going to treat this chromatic note as a dissonance since it is outside the key. Where could we add a C natural, which would imply the key of G major? During the common practice period, it is very common to have a tonicization of scale degree 4 near the end of a piece. In other words, the subdominant key or key down the circle of fifths. I also know that in measure 5, I want to land on B on the downbeat, so I can then have a full chord with a third, where B is acting like the third to G and G. Remember that when using an incomplete chord, you should at least have the third if you can. In this circumstance, the C natural works as a passing tone, connecting D and B without making a mistake with the chromatically altered note vertically or horizontally. And like I talked about, being treated like a dissonance, as you can see, it's acting like a passing tone. So now we're going to listen to this and pay attention to that tonicization of the subdominant key. Okay, now we can see the rest of it is filled out. This is a little different than usual because it's not showing note for note how this is constructed, but instead it is showing you chunk by chunk and then an analyzation of why this chunk was added, just because it appeared that measures 1 through 4 were added and then it completed to measure 5, and now we have the rest of it filled out to the end. This does not mean that this was filled out from the first note to the last note. Instead, this is how this is being analyzed. This very well could have been written from the end to the beginning, or in chunks. Either way, following all the rules of counterpoint allows us to add markers and fill in gaps starting and ending wherever we want to without having any problems, and also having nice harmony and interesting moments. The more that I study and practice counterpoint, the more that I realize that a lot of the music during the common practice period is nothing more than good counterpoint. That and also good orchestration, knowing where to put things in certain instruments, and a lot more. but on the very basis of the composition, counterpoint seems to be the main driving force of the resulted melodies and harmonies of these pieces. So with that, I'll go even as far as to say some of your favorite melodies from the common practice period can be nothing more than just a good melodic line written using good counterpoint. I'm going to get into this response in 1 second, but I like to do score reading. I was analyzing some of J.S. Bach's sonatas and partitas for solo violin, known as BWV 1001 through 1006. Okay, and the title of these works is very interesting. Pardon my pronunciation. A violino senza basso accompagnato, which roughly translates into a violin solo without accompanied bass. So the fact that it says it's a violin solo without the accompanied bass makes me wonder if it was written above a bass line. So in other words, to say that Bach had a cantus firmus that he was using, one that he probably wrote, or as we know, Bach sometimes took and borrowed music from other composers that he liked. Either way, it's the point and the idea that he could have had a cantus firmus that he was working with and then just wrote the violin solo above that. Then he just got rid of the bass line for the violin solo piece. This makes a lot of sense to me because this would help him write a lot of the complex lines that he did and have a foundation to help drive him towards where he's going to go. And I also heard something that's more of a rumor. I don't know if it's completely true, but someone was mentioning that possibly some music could have been written using multiple bass lines that work together and then writing counterpoint above each one of those separate bass lines that already work together. This kind of blew my mind when I heard this because I never heard this idea, but it makes perfect sense. So I don't know if there's any actual proof on that. Who knows? There might actually be some documentation of that. But it's something that I heard and I've always thought about it since. Okay, now for the rest of the response, we see measure 5 to the end is completely filled in. Since we must end on the tonic, it can be a good idea to not hint at the resolution too early by outlining a tonic harmony in the melody. This can actually cause it to be a weaker feeling of resolution at the cadence if we already feel like we've been floating around the resolution beforehand. This is not a bad thing, but it may not be what you want. On the other hand, it can also cause it to be a stronger ending too, but this will depend on how you score it. For example, if the last measures are creating a tonic melody, then ending in the same register can cause it to not be so strong of a resolution. However, if the last measures are creating a tonic melody, but then this ends in a much wider register that is much different compared to the measures before, this can help prepare the final resolution in the melody beforehand, but now it doesn't hinder it once it gets to the cadence, since the wide spacing of the registers is going to stick out a lot more. Therefore, in measure 6, instead, chord 6 is chosen. This is done by creating a brief implication of a deceptive cadence. In the last notes of measure 5, A and C are acting as passing tones in scale degree 4's chord of the measure, but simultaneously function harmonically to create a dominant 7th chord with the cantus. If you're going with the convention that you can only have one chord in each measure, then this might seem kind of odd. But even in those circumstances, this dominant 7th chord is merely a coincidental combination of notes that are a result of good counterpoint. Here we can see it is completely possible to create certain harmonic implications within an overall scope of a different harmony. This is if the implication occurs within non-harmony tones. From here, the second half of measure 6 to measure 7 takes advantage of a usual cadential formula in the bass that can be formed anytime the cantus is in the top line descending from scale degree 2 to 1. I've never mentioned this before, but I think this is something to consider. Some say that you cannot have an anapestic rhythm. This means a short, long rhythm, such as 2 quarter notes and a half note. Here we see in measure 6. This is something that's more commonly known in poetry writing, but nonetheless it is having 2 short durations followed by a long duration. But of course there is a rule to break this rule. Here in measure 6 we can see that the long note is tied as a suspension. Because of this, having the anapestic rhythm is perfectly fine. The one time a plain anapestic rhythm without being tied is allowed is when it occurs in the penultimate measure. This makes sense because it is a good method to slow everything down before you reach the final cadence. Other than that, it is customary to have a ritardando in the measures leading up to the cadence, where then the cadence reaches a fermata. But this is more of a tip that has to do with engraving. In measure 6 of the middle voice, G was chosen as an unaccented dissonant passing tone of a fourth on beat 4, which also creates a seventh with the upper voices, G and F sharp above it in the cantus. And there's another seventh used in measure 7, where it is used as a passing tone which resolves to the cadence on scale degree 3. Okay, so I'm going to have some practice exercises so you can practice the second, third, and fifth species in 3 voices with the 3 different cantus firmus that you saw in this video. 2 in minor and 1 in major. The minor's A minor and the major's C major, so this should make it relatively easy. Here you can choose to complete these however you want, but it's highly recommended to complete each one of these exercises for each of the different voices in each of the different species. So second, third, and fifth species. So there you'd have a total of 9 responses, but these cantus firmus are not very long, so this shouldn't be too difficult. These are going to be linked in the description, where you'll see a link to my Google Drive. You'll be able to download these, fill them in on your phone, or print them however you want to do it. Now let's move on to part 2 of the video. Okay, so now here is the example that sort of ties 4 different lessons together. First, let's start off with the counterpoint and the notes chosen and what's implied here. In Alan Belkin's 3-voice counterpoint video, he states that along with simple triads, one can now use the dominant 7th chord as long as it follows these 2 rules. 1, it's easy to sing, and 2, the 7th resolves properly. He then explains how this makes sense because harmony and counterpoint are not separate subjects. The more that you develop into creating good counterpoint, the more that you need rich harmony, and the more that you develop into creating good harmony, the more that you need good voice leading. Using the dominant 7th is a step towards the direction of tying harmony and counterpoint together into one. I'll also have a link for that video in the description. Be sure to check that out along with Alan Belkin's channel. It's a really good channel. Okay, so we can notice some things are a little odd here. We have a viola in the treble clef scored above a violin, and then we have a cello using the tenor clef. Okay, and we're going to read about scoring the cello and viola in these different clefs after I analyze this simple example. First, it's good to point out that the cello line is not quite in the tenor clef, but we're going to read about something that's going to help us understand why. But scoring the cello in the tenor clef was a really good excuse to teach 4 different lessons in one. Okay, so let's get into this. First, we're just going to be reading the notes. So a tip for reading tenor clef is think about an imaginary treble clef instead of your tenor clef. Just think of the same notes as a treble clef, and each time you see that note, you think 1 down. Versus if you saw an alto clef, you'd think 1 up. Okay, so let's try this out. If we're thinking of a treble clef, we're looking at the bottom line of measure 1. If we're thinking about a treble clef, this is a G. Now we just think 1 note below that is an F. We can further prove this to ourselves by building a chord on that note. Now if we build 2/3 above that, we see we'll have the note A and then C. And we will see C intersects with the middle of the tenor line. The middle of the tenor line tells you where middle C is, as well as the middle of the alto line tells you where middle C is. So with that, we now know where we are in the register. We're F below middle C, and we know where middle C is. It's that one line below the treble staff. So if we think about F below that, we can just see that that would be the second to last line of the bass clef, and that's where this F note is on the tenor clef. Okay, now that we know how to read the tenor clef, we can see the next note looks like what would be an A in the treble clef, and because of that, it's a G. We can also see the note before this was just an F, so that makes perfect sense. Then we look at the last note of the bottom line, and we see what looks like a D, so in fact, this would be a C. We can also observe it's a 5th down from the G, a note before. Okay, so now we can efficiently read what's going on here. Reading vertically, we can see that the first measure has an F on the bottom line with the cello. Above that has an A in the violin. Above that is an F in the viola. The F in the viola steps down to an E. So we can see that having F, A, and F is nothing more than implying an F major chord. But we can see that in the viola, when the F goes down to an E within the harmonic context of an F major chord would be the seventh. So again, we see a dissonant passing tone acting like the seventh degree of the scale. So we can see here again is more of an implied seventh chord, where the seventh of the chord is accessed through one of the dissonant melodic devices, such as a passing tone or a neighboring tone, or maybe even a suspension. But in the next measure, we see the dominant seventh chord, and we see that the seventh of the chord is accessed without being one of the dissonant devices. Because of this, this is actually going to be highlighting that seventh chord instead of being a coincidence like the measure before. So looking at the notes in measure 2, remember again, we see that G in the cello with a B in the violin above it, and then a D in the viola above that. So of course right now, GBD, we know that as the fifth chord of C major. Here we are in C major. So for now, it's a simple major triad, but then we see the viola leaps up a third to the seventh of the chord. And again, not using one of the dissonant melodic devices of counterpoint, now there is no doubt that here we are creating a 5-7 chord. Loud and clear, and we see that the seventh of the chord resolves down a step. Just like I talked about in my tendency tone video, the chordal, as in chord-ol, seventh, has a tendency to resolve down a step. On top of that, scale degree 4 has a tendency to resolve down a step. And we can note that the seventh created on a dominant seventh of the key is the fourth scale degree. As we have G, B, D, and F as our seventh, we know that F is the fourth scale degree of C major. Therefore, we see this supported in two ways. One being the seventh of a chord wanting to resolve down a step, and two being scale degree 4 wanting to resolve down a step. Or in other words, Fa, which wants to resolve down a semitone below it to Mi. We can also see that in measure 2 in the middle line, in the violin, the note B resolves up a step to C. This can be looked at in a few ways. A modern analysis of this would be that the seventh degree has a tendency to resolve up a half step, which we commonly know to as the leading tone. Here in major, we already have the leading tone without raising anything. Or this could be thought of as T to Do in movable solfege, or here we're in C major, even fixed solfege. But if we think about hexachordal solfeggio, we can see that B to C would be accessing the upper hexachord of C major, making the relationship of B to C, Mi to Fa. So in the violin, we have Mi to Fa, and in the viola, we have Fa to Mi, thinking about the lower hexachord of C major, where F to E is Fa to Mi. I'm going to have a video on hexachordal solfeggio coming up, so look out for that. That's going to be a game changer in understanding counterpoint a lot more, and also understanding the style of music of what is known as the common practice period, which is kind of a blanket statement for many, many years and generations of different music. But people know what I mean when I say it, so this is why I use it. Okay, in a second we're going to read about some stuff revealing why the cello is not really in a range that would be the best to put it in the tenor clef. But before we do that, I'm going to share with you 2 tips for reading transposing instruments in 2 different keys. Now that we know how to read the tenor clef, when you're reading a B-flat transposing instrument, just think of an imaginary tenor clef, and you will be able to transpose at sight a B-flat transposing instrument, and then you just have to keep in mind the accidentals of B-flat and make adjustments according to the key you're using. And then that takes me to reading E-flat transposing instruments. For this, it's similar, but you think of an imaginary bass clef, and then the accidentals that come with the key of E-flat major. and then make adjustments according to what key the instrument is scored in. Okay, now to read about scoring the viola and the cello. Okay, now we're going to read some tips from OrchestrationOnline. If you don't know about Thomas Goss and his YouTube channel and website, you really got to check it out. He's dedicated a massive amount of resources to learning about orchestration for free online. He also has Patreon, which I'm not a part of, but I can only imagine has a lot more. You'll find a ton of things on his channel, and throughout the many things that he has taught me, I'm going to then figure out my own way to pass on this knowledge to you, and all that's right around the corner. We're basically preparing for that right now. Okay, so let's get into it. OrchestrationOnline. It's called the Orchestration Tip. It is tip number 94 from his 100 more orchestration tips. He says to be released in 2019. And I'll let you know, yes, it did come out, and I printed it and also put it in a nice binder. The cover on the front with each page just hole punched. I guess it's more like this. And it opens, and you can read all your orchestration tips. He has separate sections in it, where within the contents, you have tips 1 through 30 about winds, 31 through 55 about brass, 56 to 69 percussion, 70 through 75 harp, 76 through 100 strings, plus 20 more orchestration questions that are answered. Not only that, but within each section, there's a navigation. It starts with the brass section, and then it gets into the section topics, which include the horn, trumpet, trombone, tuba, and then you can go to the index, where the index is found at the end of each of Thomas's books, which in this book happens after those 20 answered questions. You have an index of each tip, so you can read in text a description of each of the tips in the books. These are jam-packed with information. I'm saying these because he also has the original orchestration tips. As you can see, I printed it out. Same thing, I have it in a whole binder. Along with, he has orchestration classes online. Here you can see a studying string orchestration class, where I again have another binder, where there's a bunch of information that teaches you everything you need to know about scoring for stringed instruments. A lot of the information in here is very similar to what you're going to find in an orchestration manual, but instead of being all in one book and trying to fit all in one book, Thomas instead created separate sections for things like studying for string orchestration, which this goes along with his online class for the same topic. And I basically find it like a more organized version of the information that you'll find in an orchestration manual, but then he takes it a lot further than what you're going to find in an orchestration manual and actually gives you the information to understand everything a whole lot more. Okay, now that you're familiar with some of the stuff that Thomas Goss has to offer, let's read about this article on his website. As you can see, the picture on the top shows viola clef changeovers, where you see a viola where you'd probably imagine being an alto clef, and now you see in a treble clef, where he says the 5th position gateway for treble clef on the D string. Okay, so we have a little glimpse of what we're going to read about. Okay, now if the words were kind of small, I made them a lot bigger. Should be easier to read. So from the top, the pro-concert violist's capacity to read ledger lines is usually greater than a developing orchestrator supposes. Frequently changing to treble staff because of a few ledger lines is not helpful to the player. Another frequently asked question is, at what point should a viola part change from the alto to the treble clef? The problem is twofold: the developing orchestrator's unfamiliarity with the alto clef reading, and perhaps undue concern over scoring too many ledger lines. This results in parts that are constantly shifting between alto and treble clefs, like so. Here in this example, we see the top staff is overdoing the use of the treble clef in a passage for viola. As you can see, every measure here has a change of clef. That is the top line, where it says tortuous at the upper left corner. Down below that, where it says better in the same place, the same passage is scored much more readably. Okay, so we need to remember, we want to make this as comprehensible for the player as possible. To do this, we must understand the instrument, the strings that it has, the positions it has in the case of a bowed string instrument, or with any instrument, you should have at least a basic understanding of how the instrument works, how it creates the notes that it does, the range of notes that it has, as well as anything else that will help you understand that instrument. This over-helpfulness is the kind of thing that does more damage than the orchestrator realizes. It's far more difficult to shift back and forth between clefs frequently for a string player than to read a few extra ledger lines here and there, which they are normally already used to. It's also not especially helpful for a viola part to be scored throughout in treble clef when the notes are easily within the range of the alto clef, though either way it is perfectly readable for the player. Now we see an example above and below again. Above it says unnecessarily low. The top staff scoring is too low with the treble clef in a passage for viola. The bottom staff shows that the same passage scored in alto clef would actually be better. After reading this, we're then going to double check and we're going to understand if what I scored is reasonable or if it's unnecessary. Now we can see that the bottom example, the same passage is scored in the alto clef, and it's also labeled as better. We can see this especially makes sense for the last measure. The reason why this is perfectly readable for the player either way is that it is more than just convenience of reading. So either one of these is perfectly readable for the player, but the reason of why one is better than the other is more than just the convenience of reading or familiarity with one clef or another. It has to do with the violist's strong associations of fingering positions to notes written on a staff. A keyboard-trained composer may think of a staff as a grid representing every key in its place across which their fingers may roam, but a string player sees a staff as a navigation device charting fingering positions on a fingerboard. There's a natural flow to the fingers over certain registers of their instruments. For the violist, this association of fingerings naturally includes ledger lines, because for their first string, the A, the first normally fingered note is the first ledger line, B4, and first position ends with second ledger space E above the alto clef. Third position, which is probably the most comfortable and natural position for the player's left hand, reaches above the treble staff itself all the way up to G5 on top of the treble clef, which in the alto clef is merely the third ledger space above. Fifth position reaches all the way up to B5, the fourth ledger space, which is still a fairly common note for a violist to read. So if we think about a treble clef and we think about middle C, we know that's C4. We're not thinking about MIDI here or Ableton or something like that. C4 is one space below the treble clef, middle C. So if we think about C5, that's going to be the C that occurs in the treble staff, the third space of the treble staff, in other words. There's C5. So you know that each C is going to be the range of the next octave. In other words, we have C4, then we have C5. To further explain that, the note below C5 would be B4. Then once it gets up to the next note C, now it's C5, the next octave, 5. Therefore, we think about G5, we think about a fifth above that note. Okay, and there we would see that we'd be one space above the treble clef. Okay, so technically on top of the treble clef, but it's pointing out here that in third position in the alto clef, it's only 3 ledger lines above, which the player would be used to reading. But then he says how the fifth position reaches all the way up to B5, which is the fourth ledger space above the alto clef, and that's still fairly common for the violist to read. Okay, we can think about this in two ways. One that is each position, each time, goes up a note with each finger. As we can see, if we compare the first note in each position, it goes up one note. Same with all the other notes, so we know that from the third position to the fifth position, the same fingering for third position is going to go up a third for fifth position. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4 talks about the fingerings. May not be familiar with the string instrument fingerings, but I'm going to go over all that on this channel soon enough. In other words, where we were already on G5, where I explained, now we're just a third above that on B5. And we can also see that, but now we can comprehend what's happening in each position of the instrument. And we can still see that when you glance at the last note of the fifth position and you see those four ledger lines, it's pretty obvious because you can see it's almost like the three kind of stand out and then you see one above that, or you can see the four all together with 2 and 2. Of course, it gets even easier with 3 and 2. So as you can see, reading ledger lines is actually not all that difficult if you're used to knowing what note is there. If you play it all the time, if you see it and practice it all the time, it's probably just going to be the same as anyone else reading a note in any other spot above, below, or within the staff. But he goes further to say it's not enough to think purely in terms of what note the violist can reach in which position, and how high it's written on the first string. As he wrote above, there is a natural flow to the fingerings over certain registers. And that flow is also from string to string. Simply looking at viola scales on the first and second strings, we can see how the association of fingerings to alto clef positions is crucial to the natural reading of the violist, and how the ledger lines fit naturally into that scheme. Changing to treble clef when the note gets high just forces the player to readjust that visual association back and forth constantly. Okay, so we see here we're thinking about positions and we're seeing the strings, but we're seeing that it's going through different strings on the same position in order to create a scale of a key. Here we have a G scale. It could be G major or minor, depending on what exact accidentals the player plays. The point is that this is going from string 2D to string 1A. Thinking about C as the fourth string then. So C, G, D, A, those are the strings of the viola. I guess I could simply explain that the strings of a violin are G, D, A, E, and that being G below middle C. Then if you go a fifth below G below middle C, then you have the first string of the viola, where then it also goes up fifths, just like the violin, but instead now you have the strings C, G, D, A, and if you go down an octave from the first string of the viola C, you have the strings of the cello, C, G, D, A. The double bass is a little different, being tuned in fourths, where you have the strings E, A, D, and G, but it's good to note that the E string often can have a device known as an extension, which can actually extend the string itself, allowing it to be played all the way down to C below that E, allowing the double bass to access the same notes that the cello would, but an octave lower. Of course, more on that, the video's soon to come, but we see here Thomas also followed a common scoring practice to where if you see string 2, which is D, and string 1, which is A, and that's specified, he then doesn't specify that later, but shows you 2, 1, 2, 1. And this is something similar to what you see in music scoring, to where we as trained musicians have to know that this still means string 2 and string 1, and we can also further prove this to ourselves and make sense of this if we are unsure in our mind at all. Okay, so we see the double bar lane separating this section where we have the fourth position doing an A scale. Okay, so here it's showing fourth position on the two strings again. We have the D string and the A string. We're seeing a pattern here, okay? These two different strings in one position are being used to access one key or scale. Being able to play all the notes in that key in a scalar run helps you to access all the notes within an octave of that key. Then we move on to the next example. Same thing, except now we're moving on to the fifth position B flat scale, where again we see the D and the A string, and we see how those are used together in one position to create one scale or one key. The next thing to note is you very well could have chose G flat and A flat and B flat, as each position just goes up a note. So when and how should you score viola in the treble clef? Instead of the brutally simple calculation of not writing too many ledger lines, use the elegant approach of thinking in fingering positions. He says that he personally uses fifth position as the gateway between the alto and treble clefs. It's a very good tip right there. So this has to do with understanding this one specific instrument. This all has to do with the one instrument, viola. Then he goes further to say, though it is hard to boil down a very subjective approach into some hard, cold guideline, he shows a checklist to show how you might apply it. So as you can see, the resources that Thomas Goss has to offer are very in-depth and don't just leave you to try to understand everything and explain everything to yourself, but furthermore, you kind of get to sit back and have him explain everything to you and then think about the vast amount of information that he just gave you. I prefer this a lot more than having vague information and trying to figure it out on myself. Okay, so let's look at the checklist that he gave to us. First, let's analyze the score and any notes. We see 3 different examples with some engravings on it, but in the notes we see it says 5th position plus is still fine for alto clef reading. Okay, so for the first example he says if the passage merely reaches the top 5th position, then remain in alto clef. If 1 or 2 notes here and there go higher, but there are a lot of other notes in the passage on lower strings, also remain on the alto clef. So now, after reading the above passage, we understand that reading all these ledger lines for a violist is actually something that they're going to be used to. And we can also see that he shows that this goes up to the 5th position plus, and it's still fine for alto clef reading. Okay, so here we can see we're going up to 5 ledger lines. And I don't want to be redundant because what he said is pretty simple, but just to reiterate what he said, we can see that the majority of the passage does not go up high enough to be justified as being scored in the treble clef for viola. We do see it hits the 5th position, and then he shows it even goes past that, but we look at what it's surrounded by and the majority of what's going on, and it fits much better in the alto clef. And this way, there's not a random treble clef here where then the player has to, in the middle of playing, switch their methods of reading, and then switch it again once you get back down to the alto range. That takes us to the second example, where he shows if the passage proceeds to higher positions, change to treble clef at the start of a 5th position phrase around F5 for the A string or B4 on the D string rather than higher up. So we can see here B flat, that is the first finger of the 5th position on the D string, and he shows that this is what he calls the 5th position gateway for the treble clef change. And as we can see from this first finger on the 5th position of the D string, then it keeps ascending up. And where it does dip down is much above that 5th position on the D string. Versus the example before, to where yes, we did remain up high for a period of time, but it was a brief moment that returned back down to where we came from. Okay, now we have the third example. We see a note that says there's no need to change back to the alto clef for this bar. And he says, where possible, score entire phrases and passages in treble clef, provided that a significant amount of the scoring lies around the 5th position and above. The more extensive the phrase or passage, the more you may dip below 5th position and yet remain in the treble clef, but don't go overboard. Of course, that's with all things. And now, this makes sense why he's saying there's no need to change back to the alto clef for this bar, because as we can see, this dips down quite low compared to where any of the 5th positions of the viola would be. Here we do see this dips down quite low compared to where it was before, but in terms of position, we could see this would still be easy for the viola player to play. So in conclusion, it is interesting to note that composers have tended to trust the viola player's competence in reading quite high scoring in the alto clef, so a few notes here or there just sitting atop stacks of ledger lines are par for the course. Okay, so now we can go back to the example of the 5/7 chord from Alan Belkin. We can see, was it really necessary to score the viola here? And we'll see, no, it really wasn't, but it gave a good excuse to teaching this lesson. Okay, so let's see what happens if we change this treble staff into an alto clef. But first, let's do this in our head and think about where this is. So we know middle C is 1 below the treble staff. If we think an octave above that, we're going to see C, the 3rd space of the treble staff. And then we see a 4th above that C is the note F. So we could call this F5. We could then see that would make this E5, D5, okay? Now with that understanding, let's turn this into the alto clef and see what happens. First, let's remember the alto clef shows middle C where it's intersecting. So if we think an octave above that C, we look in the area of an octave, we look for the note C, we see a C is the second space above the alto clef, and then a fourth above that, look at that, we have F, and it's only 3 ledger lines up. And we can see that even for someone that's not a violist like me, it's perfectly easy to read 3 ledger lines up. And then the other ones go to 2 ledger lines. The most we have are 3 ledger lines. So we can see that it really was not necessary to score that in the treble clef, but now we know we are able to. We also know that what I originally had is still perfectly readable, it's just unnecessary. Okay, and then we had the cello in the tenor clef, which I already said is not really the best time to be using that. Now let's read about the cello being scored in different clefs. Okay, now moving on to the next one, and don't worry, because this is actually simpler and shorter. Although we do see access to 3 different clefs here with the cello, tenor, and treble clef, this is a much simpler and shorter read. And now that we've talked about each of the clefs enough in this video, it's a good chance to look at why each clef is called what it is. The bass clef is also called the F clef, and as you can see, the note that it is representing for the staff is the line that exists in between these 2 dots. And as we can see with a bass clef, that would be the note F. This is why this is called an F clef, because it intersects that note F. Also, the alto clef and tenor clef are known as C clefs. This is because wherever they are, it intersects the note C. So we know this is a tenor clef because the alto clef exists in the middle of the staff, while the tenor clef shifts up a line to where it is on the 4th line of the staff, one above the middle. Now we know that this would be the note C, where it is intersecting right in the middle. And then looking at the treble clef, we see this sort of swirl here that intersects the note G, but as you can see, it kind of looks like a G a little bit, and it originally was a G. As we can see here with the early variations of the treble clef and how they progressed throughout time. Okay, now getting into it, cello, registers as defined by clefs. Again, if you didn't notice, this is another OrchestrationOnline article or tip, kind of like both. And that means it is written by Thomas Goss. The headline is, "The 3 different clefs used by the cello serve as natural boundaries to its 3 essential registers." The cello has 3 main registers, which correspond quite well to both vocal ranges and their respective clef signs, bass, tenor, and soprano, which is actually a treble clef. A wise orchestrator recognizes that these clefs do more than just setting a comfortable range where the pitches may be written and read. Rather, they convey a certain sense of location from which a specific type of sound, not just pitch, may be executed. Let's start with the bass clef. In essence, the range of the notes following the bass clef in the example below are those of a bass baritone, from C below the staff to E above it. Though the cello is, of course, stronger and more secure throughout all the notes of its range than the average baritone singer, there are still many similarities. An ability to force the tone in ascending phrases, as well as complex timbre created by rich vibrato on lower notes. There's also a sense of solidity that parallels a lower vocal range. In the cello, this is because the notes are all being played in the lower positions, no note needing to be played any higher than a fifth above any open string. Consequently, the strings can be at their greatest possible length and resonance for any given note of a phrase. Now jump to the tenor clef. The range here is somewhat smaller. Sam Adler actually quotes this clef as being useful for reducing ledger lines, but that is a mistake. As Thomas quotes, the tenor range is actually a unique register that has its own logical range or tessitura. It's not merely notes played higher. In the example below, I showed the lowest note of this range as being the bottom D line of the tenor clef. This is not because it's simply the lowest note of the staff. Actually, it represents both the pitch of the open D string and the first note of the fourth position on the G string. one has to assume in tenor clef that either notes will be played only on the top two strings, or that notes will be played in higher finger positions on any string that fits a certain arc of phrasing and bowing across three strings. Either way, the sound will have a more intense character, very much like a tenor voice, due to a small average string length and greater tension. If the part one is composing uses all of the notes in this register, occasionally going up to the high B and beyond, then this clef should be used throughout the passage, not just stuck here and there where the ledger lines get too high. And finally, there's the soprano range in the treble clef. Just a quick word of warning here. The treble clef in older scores from the mid-romantic and before show soprano clef as transposing down an octave. So watch out if you're reading a very old engraving with treble clef notes in C in the staff. With treble clef, notes from C in the staff and up are a general benchmark for justifying its use. Okay, so pay attention to that. In the treble clef, the C in the staff. To play these notes, a cellist must either be very high up on the A string, a tight but sweet tone with the right application of vibrato and bowing, or playing natural and artificial harmonics, a more glassy, distant tone. In both cases, the voice of the cello ascends to a new level of range, unlike that of either the bass or the tenor. And the conclusion is, so next time you're scoring cello lines, consider the clefs not just as pitch markers, but more so as guidelines to different registers, areas of the cello with their own unique sounds and possibilities. Where we see this translated into certain positions and also the strings of the instrument, where it's not just thinking about the notes and where they are themselves in the register, but how this all corresponds to the instrument itself and how it is able to access the notes. With a string instrument, you're having to go through different positions and different fingerings on one string to access your different notes, also being able to go through the different strings, but essentially doing that on all the strings that you have. So all this just helps understand the instrument more. The biggest thing to get out of this is to be very proficient on understanding not only the placement of notes on the staff that correspond to certain strings on your instrument or certain fingerings in certain positions, but also where those are in the register so you can easily make sense of how those correlate in the other registers. The last example he shows the Mahler Symphony No. 4, Movement 1, cello part 7 bars before to 13 bars after figure 15. Note how the scoring brilliantly utilizes all three clefs, not just to reduce the ledger lines, but setting each phrase in its ideal register. Okay, so now that we've learned about scoring in the different clefs for the cello, let's look at the example I showed earlier and see why it wasn't the best time to use the tenor clef in that situation. Let's first note the range that he recommends for scoring the tenor clef. So we see the minimum recommendation is the note D, the first line of the tenor clef. Okay, back to the example again. Quick refresher, we had the note F, G, and then C. And we can see where C lands is just a note below the very minimum that Thomas recommended for scoring in the tenor clef for the cello. And as we read, this was recommended for very good reason. Therefore, having this F and this G then go to the C would make a lot more sense being scored in the bass clef. If we switch this to a bass clef, then we can see there's no problem with reading that at all. Okay, we can also see the fifth difference in the tenor clef and the bass clef. So one more time, we can see the tenor clef is a fifth down compared to the bass clef. Now this is easy to comprehend because if we look at where the bass clef is currently, the note that we're looking at, the F, if we were looking at a tenor clef, we know that this would be the note C. Okay, now think about what we're looking at. Now we're looking at the bass clef. Where's that same C, middle C? That would just be a fifth above what we're looking at. So you can see what's in the bass clef is a fifth higher than what's in the tenor clef, and the tenor clef, looking at it, is a fifth lower than what we're looking at with the bass clef, as you can see again here. just something good to comprehend. Little things like this just are markers that help you figure out the register better, especially if you're thinking about everything in your head. Fifth is really easy to think about. It's also easy to visualize because you just think either going up 2 lines or going up 2 spaces from where you're at. The cello's in the bass clef, and as we can see, everything's fine, and this would actually be a better way of scoring this. So I hope you enjoyed the video. We learned about quite a lot in this video, and now we're going to be ready to move on to 4-voice counterpoint, where we're going to see a plethora of different counterpoint lessons built upon these basic lessons taught here. It's good to practice 3 voices and even 2 voices, maybe even as much as you would with 4 voices, because if you do enough score reading, you'll find that a lot of music is built with sometimes even just 3 voices, and maybe even sometimes only 2 voices. Having only 3 voices is extremely common though, even though people think 4-voice harmony is like the ultimate be-all and say-all. 3-voice harmony is also really good. But 4-voice harmony allows you to access a lot more notes, but at the same time, you have to think about doubling notes a lot, and things come at a double-edged sword. So like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more videos, there's a lot more around the corner, and comment if you're confused about anything or had any questions or just want to leave a comment. Other than that, I will see you in the 4-voice counterpoint video. Until then, take care. Goodbye.